Okay, well, officially welcome everybody. So we have here Hamilton Southeastern. Congratulations on making it for our third day of competition. And we are thrilled to invite Unit 1 judges and participants here today. So my name is Emily Voss. I am the We the People coordinator for Virginia. I'll also be serving as the timer and facilitator. In just a moment, I'm going to hand things over to the judges. They'll introduce themselves. They'll ask you to do the same and introduce your teacher. And then they'll go ahead and read you your question. You'll have your 4-minute response. And then, as I believe you know, there's a couple extra minutes of follow-up time allotted for today's hearing. Okay, so please, I will mute myself, and judges, please go ahead and take the reins.
Hello, Indiana. It's really great that we get to spend time with you today. Congratulations on being here. My name is Sue Leeson, and I'm a senior justice on the Oregon Supreme Court. Mariam?
I'm Miriam Amarsadeghi. It's a true pleasure to be with you again. I serve on the board of the Center for Civic Education. I was a participant in the program the very first year it was offered on the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. And I spent a good part of my career so far providing opportunities in civic education to people living in the Middle East region, particularly Iran, where I'm originally from.
Sure. Tim?
My name is Tim Moore. I'm from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. Go Badgers.
On that sour note, we're doing question 1 today. Benjamin Rush said, "The American war is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles evident in modern times?" We look forward to hearing from you.
Founder Thomas Jefferson stated,
"What countries can preserve its liberties if its rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance?"
Preservation of resistance and revolutionary principles described by Jefferson have been repeated throughout history and prevalent during the founding period of the United States.
More recently, events such as the storming of the United States Capitol illustrated the spirit of resistance. Principles such as consent of the governed and limited government influenced the writing of the Constitution to a great extent.
During the founding period, revolutionaries noticed fatal flaws in the British government and wanted to correct these when crafting their own form of government. Enlightenment thinker Baron de Montesquieu proposed separation and accountability between powers within a government and stated,
"It is necessary from the very nature of things that power should be a check to power."
Separation of powers and checks can be seen throughout the Constitution, with the creation of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches.
Additionally, revolutionaries noticed the lack of checks and balance within the British government. This absence in accountability led to the formation of state constitutions in places such as Massachusetts, in an attempt to keep the power of the governing body in check. Revolutionary principles have impacted the way Americans viewed their democratic system and the documents that founded it.
These documents, chief amongst them the Constitution, limit United States government. Philosopher George Sabin paraphrased the Huguenot Vindicate contra tyrannis as saying,
"The people lay down the conditions which the king is bound to fulfill. Hence they are bound to obedience only conditionally, namely upon receiving the protection of just and lawful government."
However, when amendments to the Constitution are created, it is not citizens who dictate changes, it is government officials. Because of this, ratification and changes to the Constitution are not entirely representative of the consent of the governed. This is important as changes to the Constitution outline limitations upon those same government officials, effectively making them self-regulating.
In contrast, founders Madison and Hamilton would argue citizens elect officials who participate in civil discourse, justifying any changes to the Constitution agreed upon by elected officials as representing the consent of the governed. Regardless, it is an arduous process to ratify amendments in the Constitution, as Congress requires a 2/3 majority to pass an amendment. And with the aggressive political climate of the modern age, passing amendments is extremely difficult.
President Franklin Roosevelt stated,
Remember always that all of us, and you and I especially, are descended from immigrants and revolutionists.
The United States was built on revolutionary concepts such as the consent of the governed and limited government, which endured into the modern day to a great extent.
Limited government in the Revolutionary period was marked by the significance of the separation of powers. Balance has been reflected through Supreme Court decisions such as Bernie v. Flores. This ruled that the federal government's use of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act exceeded authority under the 14th Amendment.
Consent of the governed has similarly persevered into the modern day. Author Ayn Rand described consent of the governed as,
"The government is not the ruler, but the servant or agent of the citizens."
This concept has been advanced recently in relation to faithless electors in Shafalo v. Washington, which held states have a right to enforce punishment onto electors acting against the popular majority in the casting of their electoral ballot. This advances the presence of citizens in the civic process, furthering their agency.
Despite revolutionary principles being present in contemporary government, it is important to remember the cautionary words of anti-federalist Mercy Otis Warren.
The progress of the American Revolution has been so rapid that the principles which animated it to the noblest extortions have nearly been annihilated.
This concludes our testimony. We are now ready for your questioning.
Terrific. Tim, would you like to start?
So here's my question about these Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Why did the Anti-Federalists believe they were the revolution, the inheritors of the American Revolution, and the Federalists were not?
Well, the main toss-up between Federalists and Anti-Federalists was how big to make the government. The Anti-Federalists wanted a small government, a confederatory government at the beginning, and the Federalists wanted a larger, more federal-style government, hence their name. However, they both took principles from the Enlightenment, such as Immanuel Kant's principles on autonomy, and applied them in different ways. The Anti-Federalists thought that they were carrying over the spirit of the Revolution by guaranteeing the autonomy of individual states, by having each state have the same power over another. However, the Federalists themselves thought they were guaranteeing the autonomy of the individual citizen by providing them a better government which would be more efficient in addressing their needs.
Furthermore, with this idea, we can see that anti-federalists would argue that they were the revolutionists or the descendants of revolutionists because of the principles in which they enacted in order to get a Bill of Rights into the Constitution. And with this idea, they showed that they were truly trying to protect the rights of the people in this newly established government, because as they had seen before, especially in England, with a federal government or with one major government, this power can oversee or supersede the rights of the citizens, and they wanted to ensure that these rights were truly protected when this country was continuing to develop.
So I will admit I'm now confused. Help me out. So the Anti-Federalists argued for the autonomy of the states, while the Federalists argued for the autonomy of the citizens. And yet it's the Anti-Federalists who are arguing for a Bill of Rights which limits the national government. It doesn't follow for me how there's any consistency in those views of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Straighten me out, please.
Can you clarify the question for me?
Well, it's your statement that the Anti-Federalists advocated for the autonomy of the states. The Federalists advocated for the autonomy of citizens. But it's the Anti-Federalists who advocate for a Bill of Rights. That just doesn't square with this notion that states have autonomy over their citizens. Or what am I missing?
Well, the Bill of Rights was a compromise overall. With the federal government, it was very difficult for the Anti-Federalists to argue for states' rights in the face of the failure of the Articles of Confederation. So when it came down to it, they had to make a decision: will we guarantee rights overall, or will we guarantee states overall? And the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists came to a compromise in the Bill of Rights, where they guaranteed rights more so than states' rights.
Okay, Marian.
You begin with the concept of resistance, and consent is expressed in a number of ways in our democratic system. But then we have things like protests over George Floyd. How do you see the role of civil disobedience in the United States today as far as the goal of attaining consent?
So one philosophers such as T.H. Green would argue that it is the citizens' duty to express their discontent and therefore their lack of consent via some kind of action when the government oversteps its bounds or their discontent with the way that the government is acting. And whether that be through civil disobedience or in some cases radical action, such as the events we saw on January 6th at the Capitol, many philosophers such as T.H. Green would argue that those are morally justified. And while they may not be a legal right or legally justified, they are morally and ethically correct, even if they are misguided at times.
However, philosophers such as Edmund Burke would argue in his ideas and the reflections on the French Revolution that you should look rather to reform a form of government rather than go against it in a violent fashion. He obviously saw the first-hand account of the French Revolution and, Robespierre's reign of terror afterwards, and he saw the bloody discourse that happened. So he thought it would be more beneficial to have more of a peaceful Reformation type of idea to France, and that can be applied today to the United States.
With that idea that my colleague just presented, this ties into the idea of revolution presented by Aristotle. And this can be seen with civil disobedience because one of the methods of revolution that he argued for was the change of an existing constitution in peaceful manners. And through this method, civil disobedience can lead to this revolution or changes in society overall, because by keeping it peaceful and making changes, society can progress and be more modern, and the Constitution can be more applicable to a modern era. But it can also not result in the complete overhaul of the U.S. government, which could lead to violence or other consequences that we may not foresee for now.
I have a question about the nature of the American Revolution. How is our opinion of what that revolution was over determine how we see reform movements or subsequent revolutionary movements? I mean, what was the American Revolution over? Let me start there. What were they fighting over?
Originally, the American Revolution was argued to be about representation primarily. The colonists mentioned multiple times about representation in petitions and letters and documents and correspondences. So they overall wanted representation. However,
so how does that drive subsequent reform movements?
So
or are all our modifications of representation revolutionary?
Because the colonists and the revolutionists of the American Revolution argued for greater representation, oftentimes it is seen as carrying the torch when we expand representation for them. However, at the same time, there have also been arguments for more restrictions on representation, also playing off the colonists due to their overall fear of the populace and the way in which they employed somewhat anti-revolutionary principles into the Constitution.
One such idea that leads to reformation and the idea of representation in government can be the idea of the women's rights movement throughout the 20th century. It was an overall very peaceful revolution of trying to get women more represented, the right to vote. This can be seen, women wanted to be more represented in government as they had not the right to vote in the United States. So that can be an idea of a more peaceful type of reformation that can be seen in the United States.
I'm curious, when you talk about the founding period, what does that mean to you? What is the founding period?
The founding period can be split multiple ways. We could talk about the founding period as in 1776 and the Revolutionary Era. We could talk about the foundation of the Constitution, the actual foundation of our government. We could talk about the newest revolution where all people were actually given the right to vote in the early 19th century. Really, when it just comes to the founding period, it would be referring to this revolutionary period of all the great figures we see and all the founders that we have come to know.
So when you talk about the founding period in your presentation, you're talking about 1776?
Usually 1776 to 1783 or so.
So what went on at the Constitutional Convention is really not part of the founding period, and the revolutionary principles had already been established by then, So the goal of the Constitutional Convention was to figure out ways to implement those principles. Is that a fair conclusion of your presentation or summary of where you are?
Yes, with that idea, all of the revolutionary period or the founding period, as we discussed, is an accurate view because these revolutionary principles had already been established throughout the people and throughout the colonists in the United States, such as the consent of the governed and wanting a more limited government. And with this built into this led up to the formation of the Constitution. They were separating events because by having people believe in these spirits beforehand, it shows how the Constitution and how the Articles of Confederation were designed to meet these revolutionary principles.
Thank you. Mariam?
Duty to express consent, that struck me. You mentioned that this is something that is part of the democratic set of responsibilities and the spirit. How do you see it in your world today, in your country today? Where do you see your duties to express discontent?
So one of the primary ways that citizens these days in the modern era express their discontent is through demonstration and public action. And that can manifest itself through social media, which is a fairly recent development.
You primarily, you four people, where do you see your civic responsibility being most required of you right now? What is, okay, thank you.
Every time we get to the really fun stuff, somebody yells time.
You guys were thinking hard. You guys were thinking hard throughout this, and you've spent at least a year thinking hard. That really showed. You have a lot to be proud of. I think that the certain words came up that haven't come up in the last 2 days, for me at least, such as immigrants, and the idea of resistance. I think that you really, zeroed in on concepts that you could carry through to the end. And yeah, I'll defer to my colleagues.
Terrific. Tim?
Yes, I think your awareness of the Massachusetts Constitution's influence on the founding is commendable. The folks there are quite proud of the fact that it's the longest running constitution in the world. So they constantly remind us of that. So I'm glad you brought that to the forefront. I also appreciated your understanding of anti-federalists. Now, having said that, I would have liked a bit more on how they argued against these federalists as undermining the revolution. And we're quite, depending on the writer, we're quite apoplectic about it. So I would have liked a little more history on the anti-federalist claims that they're the true inheritors and the federalists were not. Additionally, why I asked you about this, what were they fighting over, is because I'm not sure, and I think Sue followed up too, in wanting you to tell us when the revolutionary period was. So I think a little more clarity on what they were fighting for, because if it's just government structures, I'm not sure it was truly revolutionary. You kind of made the argument that Montesquieu looms. They're implementing Montesquieu, and remember, there's an admiration of the British system in Montesquieu. So I think a little more clarity on what the revolution was over might have been helpful. But on the whole, I think your explanation of reform expansions after the equality principle in the revolution was also a strong point. So thank you. And Janet, congratulations on these students getting here in your efforts.